We
I
get
just want to
rolling.
welcome everyone here. We're very excited to show some of the collections in the textile division. And Dana is a true Renaissance woman here at the Rhode Island Historical Society. She works in textiles as well as with the library materials. So, Dana, I'm looking forward to it as well.
All right. Well, let's get started. Yeah, let's start. Okay. Next slide. So I'm going to start today with one of my favorite love tokens that's in our collection. You'll notice this is not a sampler. It's a thimble. This thimble belonged to Esther Willett. As you can see, it's inscribed with her name on the bottom. And has a little flower and, of course, a sweet little heart. So this would have been given to her by a loved one, possibly a sweetheart, possibly her parents, and she would have used it for most of her life. She lived in what is now East Providence, and this was abandoned, they think, a little bit before the beginning of the war, what is called King Philip's War, and it was found in the archaeological dig of the house. And now it is here. Next slide. Okay, just so this is, oh, I've lost you. Hold on. There we go. Um, this is Mary Freeborn Sampler. She stitched this when she was 13. And I don't know if anyone here can remember being 13. I can't really, but I'm sure that stitching a sampler like this would not have been what I was doing at 13. So she was born in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. She married Stephen Potter of Cranston about 7 years after she finished the sampler. And they had 9 children between 1750 and 1768. And Mary passed away in 1769. Stephen Potter then married her younger sister, Ruth, in 1770. That was not uncommon at the time. But what is so fascinating about this sampler? Next slide. So this is a detail of the hearts at the bottom, and there's a vase with flowers. Now, the hearts and the flowers are a fairly typical New England motif for samplers, and specifically for Rhode Island samplers. The vase has different types of flowers, although it is hard to tell which flowers they are. But we will see those on a piece coming up, which is a child's pocket. So these samplers, as the young ladies are learning how to stitch, um, they're learning how to write, they're learning how to read, then they have a little bit of freedom to do some designing of their own when they're working their samplers. And I like how Mary has used a gradient of silks in the hearts. So they go from dark blue to light blue to yellow to orange. It's hard to see the orange, and then to pink, and then to light pink, and then back to dark blue and light blue. And that will become important later when young ladies who have done this kind of sampler go on and they fall in love and they make pocketbooks for their sweethearts. So we'll see some of those coming up. Okay, next slide. This is the back of Mary's sampler. So she actually stitched it onto a piece of paper and wrote her name and the date. I suspect she probably did this later, not when she was 13, but later on in her life. And that funny little number in the upper left-hand corner is our accession number. That's how we label the objects in our collection so that we can record information about them. Okay, next. So this is a child's pocket. It was made around 1735. We know that because of the type of linen that was used, and also you can see my fingers in the picture holding back the opening of the pocket, and there's little red print linen lining the pocket, and that type of material is from around this time period. So those flowers we saw in the vase, you can now see those on this pocket. They're a little bit more finely stitched. So the person who has made this pocket is a little bit older. They've done their sampler, and now they've made a small child's pocket. It could have been, and by child I mean, um, a young woman between 5 and 20 would have worn a pocket this size. Women wore bigger pockets because they were larger in body, but also they carried more stuff. So this would have been worn over your under petticoat, but under your exterior petticoat or your outside skirt. And it would have been accessed through a slit in the side of the skirt. So these would not necessarily have been showing, although there's plenty of visual documentation from the time, paintings, sketches, drawings, showing pockets on the outside, but they are usually depicting women who are working, oyster sellers, um, uh, women working in a field. This pocket was not worn by a young person who was working. It was worn by somebody who had the means and the leisure to use silk, afford the fine linen, and the time to do the embroidery, and then to sew the pocket. So the linen would have been stitched in the shape, the embroidery would have been stitched in the shape of the pocket. Then it is cut out and a back is added. The back is plain on this one. We don't know who stitched this pocket or who wore this pocket, but it is a really sweet thing. And it could have been made by a mom for her child. It could have been made by a sister for her younger sister. Next slide. So this slide I've titled Love's Thorns because there's a rather sad little poem at the on the in the bottom half of the sampler, and I'll read it to you. I have seen the bright azure of morn with darkness and clouds shadowed o'er. I have found that the rose has a thorn which will wound when its bloom is no more. Oh, it's very poignant. Um, it's very, so this is Phoebe Sprague's sampler. She stitched this when she was 11, which seems young to us to learn about the slings and arrows of of love and life. And there are other samplers that look just like this one. In fact, we do have Phoebe's sister's sampler, which was done 2 years prior to this, and looks almost exactly the same, but has a different poem. Now, this sampler, you can see at the top, there's our vase with the flowers in it, although this vase also has 2 strawberries at the top. Our hearts have become more stylized. They've now become a plant or a tree, and there's only 3 of them instead of 4. If you go to the next slide, I've made an enlargement for us. There we go. So you can see the heart. The heart is now 2 colors instead of multicolored. But there is the addition of these sweet little cardinals on either side of the hearts. Love birds, perhaps? You can go forward. So around the same time that Phoebe was stitching her sampler and um, Mary was stitching her sampler, the fashion was to stitch pocketbooks as love tokens for your sweetheart, for your father, for your brother who was going off into business or on a boat to sail around the world, maybe never return. These are is the samplers for the most part in our collection are silk on linen. This is wool on wool. And a man would have used this for storing important papers, and it would have gone into their back pocket of their coat. So in the tail part of the coat from this time period, you would have put your pocketbook in there. It is not a pocketbook we think of as, a black pleather pocketbook with gold snaps that grandma had and kept tissues in. This is a proper pocketbook. It is a book that goes in your pocket. And this one is around 1750. We don't know who made it, but certainly the woman that stitched this had been doing samplers or had been to a school or was taught by somebody who was experienced in stitching. Next slide. Oh no, I'm sorry. Can you go back? I forgot. Um, you'll notice here in that there's a gradation of the color again, as was in Mary's sampler. They're closer in time to each other, but you can see how that shape, it's almost like a diamond Bargello shape. It goes from pink to darker pink to red. And then there's a purple one, and then the green one goes from dark green to light green to yellow. So if we go on to the next slide. So this man's pocketbook, Love Token, is a little bit fancier. It's certainly been stitched with much thinner wool and on much finer wool fabric. And we know who this was made for. It was made for Daniel Jackson in 1765. You'll notice that that Bargello shape has become less curvy and more angular, and that the flowers inside are sort of shaped to fit inside the angular edges. If you go to the next slide, this is how we know it was made for Daniel Jackson. There's his name on the inside of the pocketbook. Now, each flap of the inside of the pocketbook would open up, and that's where you would have tucked your important pieces of paper or your little copy of the Psalms or a small book of um, travel writing at the time. Um, this pocketbook took hundreds of hours to stitch. So this was made by a woman or a young lady that had the time and could afford the time to spend hundreds of hours stitching, doing the needlepoint embroidery, and then also sewing the lining and putting in the cardboard and putting the trim on the outside. So it is a labor of love for sure. Next slide. So this is a later pocketbook. This is around the same time period as, I'm sorry, as Phoebe's, not our Phoebe, but Phoebe's sampler that we looked at with the two cardinals. So the Bargello shape has become more condensed. It's still using that gradation of color to make the patterning. This is a very Rhode Island shape. You don't really see this kind of patterning in other New England states. Now this one we think belonged to Edward Taylor. There was a small piece of paper with a handwritten note on it that said Edward Taylor's book, 1802. And then in pencil underneath was written Sarah Whipple, now 84, September 1807. So did something happen to Edward? He didn't keep his pocketbook? Or maybe Sarah Whipple, who was now 84, wrote her name because she made it at some point for Edward. We're not entirely sure if they're related. More genealogy needs to be done. But this pocketbook took quite a lot of time to make. But very interestingly, it's made with single ply wool yarn, wool thread, and not two ply, which is what the previous pocketbook was made out of. So this is someone who is being slightly frugal. They're splitting their yarn into their thread into two pieces and using both of those pieces as opposed to sewing with them twisted together. But again, it's somebody who had the time to do this kind of stitching. So this is Susan Burrell's sampler. She was 8 years old when she stitched this. My daughter's 7, and I can't imagine her being still long enough to stitch anything like this. But this is a child who has been stitching for quite a long time, probably since she was 5. It too has a little poem on it, and it's mostly describing um, you should not fall victim to fashion, but should be pure and do nice stitches. So the poem is, My dearest girl, improve life's morning fare. The arts of dress should be your lesser care, and ornaments of taste will sure succeed. Your friend instruction with delight will blend, and fears too soon the pleasing task will end. So basically, you should enjoy your stitching so much that you will fear that it will end too soon. I think that's wishful thinking on the part of the teacher who's teaching the sampler.
And that section is called the morals.
Yeah, so that section of the sampler is called the moral, and that's usually where there's like a cautionary poem or a verse from the Bible, or there's a poem like this, which sort of implies virtue or recommends virtue over other pursuits like fashion. Next slide. So this is an up close of the tiny, dainty flowers that Susan stitched onto the sampler. And I'm not sure how clear it will come across on people's monitors, but those little black lines around the edges of the floral border, those are single stitches just into the linen to make sort of like a grayish background. That's really unusual for samplers of this era. I have not seen it on another one in our collection. So you can kind of imagine Susan being very imaginative and making these little stitches. And you could see at the bottom there are some hearts, and they are also multicolored. And if we go to the next slide, now this is one of my favorite things to do. This is the back of the sampler. So you can see where Susan tucked in all her ends. She could have been a little bit tidier. Some of our samples look the same on the front and the back. My sampler that I did when I was a child looks not this neat on the back, I have to say. This is very, very tidy. And you can also see the difference in the color, as samplers were often framed and hung in pride of place. They often faded in the sun. So if you go to the next slide, Connor. So this is, oh, too far. Go back. Okay, right there, stop. This is a side by each of the back and the front. So on the right-hand side of the image is the back, and on the left-hand side is the front. And you can see the difference in the pink on the right-hand side and the total absence of pink on the left-hand side. And you can see that the D in the alphabet is supposed to be yellow. The B is supposed to be orange, and they're more of a similar color of dingy, beige, grayish. Okay, I'm ready for the next one now. So this is another man's pocketbook. This is another love token. Now this we do know who made this. This was made by the wife of the man who carried it, and we were told by family descendants that he carried it for most of his life. His wife stitched this in England. I'm sorry, not England, in Northern Ireland, England, UK. And then when they immigrated over to Providence, they brought it with them. And you can see when you're looking at it, the two-toned flat leaves. There's a dark green and a sort of lighter green. Those are the same as the leaves on Sarah Burrell's sampler that we were just looking at in the oval. So her little tiny, tiny leaves are two-toned. And that was sort of a way you could make the embroidery look three-dimensional. So you can, this is wool on wool. Yeah, okay, next slide. Thank you. So this is not a Rhode Island sampler. This is a sampler that was done in Boston by a Rhode Island girl, Jane Carpenter. She was born in 1773. Her father, Benaiah Carpenter, died at the Battle of Long Island in 1776. And her mother remarried Captain Thomas Smart. So we do have portraits of the mother, Sarah Taylor Carpenter Smart, and Captain Thomas Smart in the collection. But we also have this sampler. So after the war, Jane was sent to Boston to be educated and learn the refinements of being a young lady in society. The sampler, it looks similar to the Rhode Island ones, where it has sort of the crenellated border, it has flowers, it has some vases with very stylized flowers at the bottom, two corners. If you can go to the next slide. But what I love about it is that there's a squirrel. That small little hunched over brown animal is a squirrel. And he has an acorn. And there's two birds. And there's a really lovely butterfly. If you continue. So women were stitching away all of these love tokens for the men in their lives. And what were they getting for love tokens in return? We know Esther Billet got a temple. But this is a woman's busk. A busk is part of a set of stays, which is another way to describe a corset. So during this time period, from the 1730s all the way through to the 1840s, when this was made, women were wearing busks or corsets to change the shape of their corset. Busk went in the front, and it was keep you very upright and stabilize your posture. And they were usually made of something stiff yet slightly flexible. So this one is carved out of baleen, and it was by a sailor, you don't know who. But it came down in a family, a Rhode Island family was given to us. And you'll notice that there's a heart, there's a crazy palm tree, and then there's these are motifs that appear in a lot of us because they're the tree of life. There's love, and then there's the eternal, everlasting memorial, of that person. Okay, next slide. We have 2 slides left. So this one is from 1750. We do actually know who this was made for. This was made for Mary Mason, and she lived in Providence, and she wore it for most of her life. As most women do, they continue to dress in the manner of their flourishing years. So this is 1750. She probably wore this through the 60s and 70s, even though corset and stay shapes changed. She would have still maintained that dress style. And it almost looks like it says mom in the carving, but that's M with a diamond and an M for Mary Mason. And heart, the heart would have gone at the top. So right next to your heart, a cutout heart from your sweetheart. Lots of hearts. Okay, final slide. This is another one from around the same time period. I think it might actually be a little bit later, maybe 1760. But this one is carved from top to bottom on both sides. And it's all patterns except for the middle, which is HXH. So two people with H in their name are in love. And then you can see them, they're holding hands. They're already scandalous in 1750 if they were caught on a bus holding hands. And the date this was made has been almost completely worn away at the time. It looks like it may have said March the 4th, 17 something, 2, and I think it was probably 6, 1762. So there's two lovely hearts just crossed over each other, and so I'm just going to read you the little note underneath the heart says, by this you may plainly see how much love that I have for thee. So those are our samplers with hearts and love tokens of a thimble, pocketbooks, and corset busks. Any questions?
Wonderful, Dana. That was really interesting.
Thank you. I tried to keep it short.
Just a reminder to anyone to send any questions to the chat or use the raise hand function. Sally asks, what would women have kept in their pockets?
Oh, women kept all sorts of things in their pockets. Actually, the best evidence we have for what they kept in their pockets are records of women being arrested in the Old Bailey in London because they detail what was in their pockets. And a lot of them say things like 2 biscuits, sewing scissors, a piece of ribbon, a small folded piece of paper. And generally, it seems to be a snack, something pointy like scissors or a penknife, and there's always a ribbon of some form or another because the ribbons were infinitely useful. That you could tie together, you could tie letters together, you could fix your shoe in a buckle emergency. And a snack, you always need a snack in your pocket.
Lane asks, how common were pockets built into garments?
Pockets were not built into garments really until the Industrial Revolution, when you didn't want to be wearing lots of layers of things and working around machinery. And that's when pockets start getting sewn into the skirts themselves instead of being a separate item.
Lane also asks, how vibrant would the samplers have been? The pockets were so vibrant, but is that because they are better preserved?
So the pockets are so vibrant because men kept them in their pockets. They weren't framed and hung on the wall, although they certainly should have been because they're gorgeous. But they were kept in pockets, and then they were kept in a chest, and then they were kept in shoebox in the back of the closet. So they weren't exposed to sunlight as much as the samplers were. And samplers it was such an accomplishment for a young lady to finish a sampler. We certainly have many in our collection which are not finished, but it was still kept by the families because it's such a monumental achievement. It takes so much time, and my daughter would probably say so much suffering. So they do this issue.
Can I follow up on that question?
Kathleen?
Hi, how are you? This is so interesting and fun. So what I'm wondering though is, would the samplers have been as vibrant as the pockets that we see now are, or would they have been?
They did use different materials. So the samplers were using silk, which is notoriously dyes are very fused quickly. And it doesn't take much sunlight or dye to be removed from silk thread. Wool keeps color much better. And so the pocketbooks are sewn in wool, so they have those bright colors. Some samplers you look on the back and they are quite muted pastel colors, but there are more of them than is visible in the front. So there's more oranges and yellows and greens. And what we see in the front now is mostly tan, taupe, brown, and then some blues, which is stayed. But the lighter blues on samplers are often green on the back, as the yellow is faded. Did that answer your question or not?
Yeah, more or less. I just was curious if you say all samples were zero beige, that's not sampler. I think like beige, and I wondered if originally they might have been as colorful as the pocketbooks, but because of the name that they conveyed, like a little bit yes, but maybe not entirely yes.
Yeah, that's the answer. A little yes, not entirely yes. Also, the linen would have been a lighter color too. So one of the damages that framing samplers, if you go back for it, has acidic ambient onto the linen, and that has also turned the linen more brown.
Got it, thanks.
So there would be more contrast.
Jamie asks, did children carry pocketbooks? If so, how young would they have been when starting to carry them?
So young boys would not have carried pocket. Oh, my phone is ringing. Sorry. That was really something that a man would have carried if they were someone who needed to keep track of important paperwork or had the money to have a published pamphlet or a published or printed book that they must carry with them. Young boys and young men wouldn't have had the need for a pocketbook yet. And of course, you want, as somebody saying the pocketbook, to choose a sweetheart that has important paper, because it probably means they're probably doing well.
Thank you. Next question for Dana.